Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ham Radio Insights YouTube channel. I'm Stuart Victor Echo 9 Charlie Foxtrot, and we have a great program here today, not just for amateurs in Canada. This is something that pertains to amateurs globally, but we're going to zero in on what's going on in Canada, what radio amateurs of Canada are doing to help make sure amateur radio stays a great hobby that it is today. And with me is Dave Goodwin, V3KG, who joins us again. You've seen Dave a few weeks ago when we were talking about traveling to Canada and different CEPT and IRP licensing agreements, and amongst a few other things. But Dave joins us today to talk about a very, very important direction and initiative here in Canada, the Defense of Amateur Radio Fund that RAC, Radio Amateur Canada, is doing. Dave, welcome back to the program. I see you brought some guests today.
Yes, thank you very much, Stuart, and good afternoon, and welcome to everybody who's listening. Yes, I brought along two colleagues of mine, Paul Coverdale, the E3ICV. He is RAC's special advisor on World Radio Communications Conferences, and he actually sits on the Canadian delegation that goes to WRCs. And Serge Vertuso is RAC's International Affairs Officer, and Serge also has a professional responsibility related to WRC. So these two men are two key players in the preparations for the next World Radio Conference.
You just answered my question of what WRC means. So, because if I was a new ham just watching this, the average POTA activator, just got my license, and you throwing out WRC, ham radio, just like the Army, is good for what we call TLAs, three-letter acronyms. So, describing what is WRC, what is its core initiative, then we'll get into the topic at hand.
Well, if you don't mind, Stuart, I actually have some notes prepared in PowerPoint, so I'd like to sort of project those, share those, and that will kind of guide the conversation. And I want to start off with a very important number, and that very important number is 9%. 9% is something that every radio amateur should be aware of. This is how much of the allocated radio spectrum that's dedicated to us. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of spectrum. So the allocated radio spectrum runs from about 9 kilohertz up to 275 gigahertz. Of that, 24 gigahertz, an awful lot of it is allowed as accessed by radio amateurs. We get that access for free. All you have to do is pass an exam. Now, if you take a look at the chart that I have on this screen, what you'll see, this is the radio spectrum allocation chart for Canada, and there are similar charts produced by every other regulatory authority in the world. So this is produced by our regulator. There's kind of an olive color that you'll see in all of these bands. This represents the chunks of spectrum to which radio amateurs have access. And if you add it all up, it's 9%. Now, it's 9% in right across the spectrum. So we don't have any amateur allocations in VLF, but we have them in every other part of the spectrum. So in the high frequency bands, the shortwave bands that a lot of us like to use for long distance contacts, amateur radio has 12% of all that spectrum allocated to us. Most of that exclusive, that is, nobody else can use it. At VHF, we have about 6%. At UHF, we have about 9%. So we have a big share of the radio spectrum, and pretty much most of the spectrum below 146 megahertz is exclusive to the amateur service. That is, no other services can use it. So all in all, in Canada, at least, we have 28 different amateur bands. Again, that's 9% of the spectrum. So the question comes up, how did this happen? How did we get so much spectrum? And I think, looking at the four of us, I think we can all agree that it's not because we're so good looking. That's my standard joke on this issue. It's because of advocacy. Is because for over a century now, we've had radio amateurs who have been able to be present in the room when the decisions were being made internationally and nationally on how the spectrum got allocated and how much of the spectrum would be given to amateur radio. So when it comes to the rules governing radio, there are some regional differences. Of course, there is an international agreement on how we use the spectrum because the radio waves cross boundaries quite easily. Canada, of course, is in the Americas, and North and South America together constitute Region 2. And there are some allocations for all the different radio services that are unique to Region 2, but a lot of those are also shared with other regions. Similarly, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Russia, Mongolia, they're all in Region 1, and Region 3 is the rest of Asia and Oceania. So in each of these regions, there are some slight differences, but for the most part, we have a pretty good system of international coordination. So we have international rules that govern radio. Now, each country has its own local radio regulations, its own local rules. In Canada, we've got law, the Radio Communications Act, we have radio communication regulations, and we have policy that governs all radio services. And of course, we have specific policies and regulations related to amateur radio. Finally, amateurs do a pretty good job of regulating ourselves, in that we have operating practices frequencies, we have band plans, we have different kinds of things that we do in the way that we use the spectrum allocated to us that also form a kind of informal regulation. So there are all sorts of different ways in which we regulate our use of the spectrum. Now, when it comes to the international element, what happens, there's a United Nations agency called the International Telecommunications Union, and the ITU has been around in one form or another since 1865. That's 160 years. It's tremendous length of time. Initially, it was the International Telegraph Union. Then it morphed when radio came. So the ITU is the UN agency where the countries of the world get together and agree on the radio regulations and the way we allocate the spectrum. Now, they do that through something called the World Radio Communications Conference. A WRC happens once every 4 years, and it goes on for about a month. And what we have are national delegations representing the 193 member countries of the ITU who are present, and they're the voting members of this organization. And they together come to agreements about how the radio spectrum is going to be used and what kind of regulations we have. We also have organizations that are present at the WRCs, like the International Amateur Radio Union. So there are 900 organizations. The IRU is one of them. And this is a way in which radio amateurs can have a voice at a WRC. Now, in Canada, we're one of about a dozen countries that have a very unique relationship with our regulator that allows us to have an actual amateur radio representative on our national delegation to the WRC. RAC, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, nominates that representative for amateur radio, and that person is Paul, the V3ICV, who's with us today. Now, Paul attends to represent the interests of amateur radio, but there are a lot of expenses involved in that, and those expenses are paid for by a fund called the Defense of Amateur Radio Fund. So going back to WRC, any WRC, the last WRC was in Dubai in 2023, and every WRC produces three things. It produces amendments to the radio regulations. It produces amendments to the spectrum allocations. So if there's some adjustments in the frequency allocations, they happen there. And finally, the third thing is they produce the agenda for the next WRC. And the day after one WRC ends, the preparatory work for the next WRC begins. And so Paul's role in representing amateur radio is to start working on those matters that might affect amateur radio in the next WRC, and at a particular WRC, he'll be representing Canadian amateur radio interests on the Canadian delegation. So we have a number of different ways in which we can influence these decisions. And frankly, we can't argue with the success we've had. So now I'd like to turn it over to Paul. Paul can speak about the kind of work that he does. So before I go on to Paul, do you have any questions, Stuart? Anything that I've said that's unclear?
Well, I'm sure you'll cover a lot of this as we go on here, Dave. You mentioned even our last conversation, how the preparatory work for WRC starts as soon as the last one finishes. And I can't remember if that was Serge or Paul that was involved with this, but you mentioned something about, allocation of part of the VHF spectrum for air traffic control or aviation navigation or whatever it was. I can't remember exactly, but it wasn't, if we didn't have an amateur radio representative there, it would never got detected or picked up.
Yes, that's kind of a nightmare scenario that came up in the run up to the previous WRC, the one in Dubai. What happened? So there's all this preparatory work that happens between WRCs, and there are a lot of things that happen at a regional level. So in North America and South America together, we have a group called CTEL. And CTEL is a body composed of all of the national radio regulatory agencies, like ISED, like the American FCC, like the national the government authority for every other country in North and South America. Similarly, there's one in Europe called CEPT, the European Conference on Post and Telecommunications. So in one of these preparatory meetings in CEPT, there was an agenda item that asked the conference to come up with more spectrum for the aeronautical mobile service. And a surprise proposal came from the French delegation in this preparatory conference. The government of France proposed sharing 144 to 146, that's the 2-meter amateur band, with the aeronautical mobile service, with the aeronautical mobile service as primary. Now, this is a nightmare because the aeronautical mobile service is perhaps the most difficult service to share spectrum with because they operate from planes way high up in the air. Of course, they have a big footprint, and at a VHF frequency, that counts for a great deal. And if they were to put amateur radio as secondary in that segment, that would seriously degrade our ability to operate on that band. And that potentially had the potential worldwide to seriously undermine amateur radio's ability to use the 2 2-meter band. And think of all the infrastructure we have on 2 meters. I mean, how many of us have a couple of handy talkies and a couple of mobile rigs? And, think of all the amateur satellites, think of all the repeaters. We have a lot of investment in that spectrum. And if it wasn't for the fact that this came up in a preparatory meeting and was able to be deflected in that preparatory meeting, we might have had a much more serious serious threat to the 2-meter band than we had. So
absolutely, yeah, right. Yeah, you're right. All that infrastructure alone. So that's good that you guys picked that up early. That's fantastic. So you brought Serge and Paul along with you today, Dave. Why don't you go ahead and before you pass the mic over to Paul, why don't you just give us a quick introduction of Paul and Serge and what they do again, and a little bit. Maybe they can tell us a little bit about themselves.
Okay. Well, first, Paul is RAC's special advisor on WRCs, and he is our designated person representing amateur radio on the Canadian government delegation. Paul I'll ask Paul, of course, can describe his own background in amateur radio, but he's very, very senior ham. Serge is on the executive of RAC, like me. He's our international affairs officer. Serge also has professional responsibilities because he's been a telecoms engineer for a very long time and is now representing a private company that is also involved in WRC preparations. So we have commercial interests, we have amateur interests, there are all sorts of other interests. So maybe I can turn it over to Paul, and Paul, you can give us a little bit of your background and start discussing your role when it comes to WRC preparations.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. So I was first licensed quite a while ago in 1965 so I've had more than 60 years as a ham, and I was licensed in the UK call sign, and that was in the days of AM mainly. But anyway, I moved to Canada in 1974, and I've been pretty active amateur since then, mainly focusing on the HF bands and DXing and a bit of contesting and a bit of antenna experimentation. So I'm very pleased to be able to represent the Radio Amateurs of Canada, and as the representative in these World Radio Communications Conferences. In my professional life, I was a telecommunications engineer, and I did a lot of work in the standards area in the ITU, so I am sort of familiar with a lot of the procedures. It's quite a formal procedure. In fact, if you look at the chart here, I guess it's presenting right now, Dave, the chart. Yeah, the chart is presenting on the screen right now. It should be. I can see it. So the World Radio Communication Conferences, they're a very rigorous multi-year cycle, and it's hosted by the International Telecommunication Union, which is, as Dave said, has been around for a long time and is the sort of the premier body in the world for international telecommunications, and it's been like that for some time now. These WRCs are held every 4 years, and what happens is because it's a very formal conference, it would take a long time to get agreement on even the agenda of the meeting. So these agendas are actually set 4 to 6 years prior. So typically at one WRC, amongst all of the things you do, you set the agenda for the next WRC, which will occur in about another 4 years' time. Next slide, please. Oh yeah. So what happens in these 4 years between the formal WRC conferences is this is where the preparatory studies are done, and this is really where all the detailed technical work gets done by what we call study groups in the ITU Radio Communication Bureau. So this is underway right now, leading up to WRC 27, and there's a phenomenal amount of activity involving meetings in Geneva typically, but not just Geneva. And this is where the detailed technical work is done to look at each of these agenda items. And typically these agenda items involve somebody wants some more spectrum or looking to produce some new services or whatever. So this all has to be discussed, and as Dave mentioned, there are a number of people involved. There's more than 190 member states from all around the world that have the privilege, if you like, of attending the meetings, and most of them do, in fact. And then there are also several hundred what they call sector members, and these are people who primarily from industry and academia, and they can provide technical input, but in the end they don't have the final decisions made. They they don't get to vote on that or to agree on that. And just as a point, all of the decisions that are made at these World Radio Communication Conferences are made by consensus. So there's a lot of very detailed horse trading goes on, if you like, to try and get some consensus on a particular item. So pretty well everything is agreed, and there's a lot of discussion goes on. As well as the preparatory studies, there is an item called the Conference Preparatory Meeting, or CPM, and this is basically almost a dry run for the next WRC. It takes place maybe 6 to 9 months before, and this is where all of the results of all the studies are compiled, put into a report, and you get some semblance of what the final outcome is going to be, but that's not cast in stone. But it's a sort of a milestone along the way to make sure that you've done all of the preparatory work. It's also there was also regional participation and regional preparation. There are regional telecommunications organizations in each of the regions of ITU. For example, the Council for European Post and Telecommunications in Europe, and CTEL is North and South America, and they meet to try and develop common positions so that you don't have 190 individual positions. Hopefully you can boil those down to a smaller number. Next slide, please. So the actual conference itself does take 4 weeks, and this is where the delegates from these member states and certain sector members, they meet to negotiate and adopt the final acts. So this is quite a big conference. They can be up to, the last one in Dubai was around about 4,000 delegates from many countries around the world. And there's a tremendous amount of work goes on, both during the 9 to 5 sort of hours, and also in the evenings, and typically at weekends also. But when it's all finished, the Radio Communications Bureau of the International Telecommunications Union then has the task of putting all this material together and updates this document called the Radio Regulations. And the Radio Regulations is what governs worldwide telecommunications. So it consists of the individual frequency allocations, going basically from a few tens of kilohertz up to multi-gigahertz, and who is assigned what. And typically in these radio regulations, there are what they call primary operators, and then there are secondary allocations. So a primary allocation is one that's they have sort of control of the frequencies, and the secondary allocations have to sort of exceed them a little bit in terms of making sure you don't cause any interference. So that's quite a big issue, is to modify this table of frequency allocations. And then they also, the WRC handles any other worldwide communications impacts. Next slide, please. Well, that's it. So basically, the bottom line is that Radio Amateurs of Canada, via ICED, which is the Canadian government department that deals with telecommunications, we have a seat at the table for all of these WRC activities. And maybe I'll turn it back to Dave now.
All right. Thank you very much, Paul. So that's basically what it goes. So you say from the time one WRC ends until the next one begins, there is all this work done at committee level, writing reports, doing analyses to try and deal with the agenda items. Because say the agenda items that are set at one WRC basically set the agenda for all the work that's going to be done between WRCs. So in the course of Paul's work, Paul, you can attend many of the meetings virtually. Some you do have to attend in person. So can you give us an idea what's involved in terms of your time commitment, including the time of day that you have to attend some meetings?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always best to be able to participate in person at these meetings, because even though they're very formal meetings, and there can be lots of controversy amongst different people with different ideas. But if you meet somebody outside of the meeting room for a coffee, then you can often come to some agreement. But so I typically try to participate in the major meetings, and there is in fact one of the working parties in the ITU. It contains the amateur service. It's working party 5A, and this one, as part of its mandate, includes the amateur service. So we certainly have a seat at the table there, and that allows us to also join in other working parties on an as necessary basis. If I don't go to meetings physically, nowadays all of the meetings are conducted remotely, or they call them hybrid meetings, and I can call in and use Zoom to participate that way. The only problem is the time change, and typically meetings in Geneva start at 9 o'clock local time in Geneva, which means that's 3 o'clock in the morning here in Eastern Canada. So sometimes you have to get up quite early. But anyway, it does give you a chance to be involved. And also, I'm sort of fully involved with with ICED itself. They have a kind of a mirror organization that looks after all of the interests, the Canadian interests in ITU, and they have their own sort of procedures which allow you to submit contributions through the Canadian process and have them introduced in the formal meetings in Geneva or wherever else the meetings are held.
So just to illustrate a little bit, Paul and Serge and I and a couple of other people have our little committee meeting every Thursday morning where we talk about the latest developments in regular thing. And the first thing we talk about is what Paul's been up to, how many meetings Paul's attended, and it just about every week there's something. And Paul's doing this strictly on a volunteer basis, of course, for the love of the hobby, to represent our interests.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm very interested in doing, and very very happy to continue doing this work. But yeah, there are other there's always something going on in between meetings, and I also do coordinate with the International Amateur Radio Union, who is they're what they call a sector member of ITU. So we do have coordination meetings and discuss. Obviously, there's issues of commonality amongst different regions around the world, and the real issue is here that Dave said that we have this 9% of spectrum, and of course, how did we get there? Well, we got there because there was a lot of advocacy in the past of pushing to get new amateur allocations, and that's been generally pretty successful. But going forward, with all of the interest now on personal communications and mobile communications, there is a very large commercial need for spectrum, frequency spectrum. So we have a lot of our spectrum is up in the VHF, UHF, and above region, and that is continually under pressure because of all of the new services that are coming along, and there's big business interests, of course, backing these commercial interests. So this is the area where we have to be vigilant, is that we don't lose some of this spectrum in the future, or at least have restrictions put on the use of the spectrum that would sort of limit its usefulness.
So Serge has been sitting here, listening attentively. Serge, anything you want to add about the dialogue so far, and maybe just let everybody know your role in this and what you're doing in Geneva and how this all ties into the big picture here.
I'm glad you asked me that, Stuart. My name is Serge Bertuzzo. I'm VA3SB. I've been licensed for 50 years. And coincidentally, that's how many years I've also been in the telecom business, 20 years with our regulator in Canada and 30 years doing ITU-related work. So right now, I'm attending one of these working party preparatory meetings that Paul mentioned earlier. So that's what I'm doing here today. I'll be here until the 15th of May, so about 3.5 weeks. And it's grueling. If people think this is a holiday, it isn't. You work your 10, 11, 12 hours a day, then you get up the next morning and you repeat. So it's quite a process. But what I was going to do is add a couple of things to what Paul was mentioning earlier, and that is, the importance of attending these meetings live. While the preparatory meetings can, in fact, be monitored virtually, if there is something that the amateur radio service wants, it's much better to have somebody attending the meetings live, because that's where you negotiate on certain elements. You can take someone for a coffee in the hallway, have sidebar discussion, but if you are participating remotely, you don't have that capability, and you lose an opportunity to do that. So it's very important, and especially the group that Paul said that he monitors closely, Working Party 5A, which deals with the amateur service. That's why he is there, because if anything like this comes up, he's able to deal with it. And the other thing I was going to mention, well, two things. The WRC, when you leave Canada and go to the WRC, we have a playbook in terms of our position on various things, on various agenda items. When you're at the conference, things can change. The first 2 weeks, everybody holds their ground and doesn't want to change their position. But after that, decisions have to be made, so there's a little bit of horse trading or whatever. And, it's the low-hanging fruit sometimes that gets tossed to the side. And, unfortunately, the amateur service is in that category that doesn't bring in the billions of dollars that these other services do. So usually, those are where you see proposals being made to accommodate one service or another, like the aeronautical service. And they would go after the low-hanging fruit, like the amateur service. So that's why it's important to have somebody at that meeting, because, they can intervene with the regulator there. Because if these things come up at the meeting, no one calls the stakeholders in Canada to say, hey, by the way, there was a proposal. No, decisions are made at the conference by the delegation who's there on the ground. And the other thing I wanted to mention is the importance of regional groups. And Paul spoke about two of them. There are actually 6 regional groups around the world. There's the Asia Pacific, the Russian group, there's the Arab group, Africa, CEPT, and CETEL. But the importance of these groups are that if you go to the conference and there's a problem in terms of agreeing on an approach going forward, and that's pretty difficult when you have 193, 194 countries trying to come up with a single proposal. What the chairman of the group usually does is call in the regional representatives, and he'll get 2 or 3 people from each region to come in, and they, as a group, will decide on the approach that they will use. And that's why it's also important for Paul, myself, and others, and the IARU to monitor regional activities around the world as part of our preparations as well. So that's what I was going to say about that. If no one has any questions, I can go on to the defense of amateur radio if you'd like.
Well, let's come back to the fund actually in a bit. Dave, you want to take that slide off?
Okay.
That'd be great.
Okay.
We can have some general dialogue, because I do have some questions brewing around that. So a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago now, I did a video talking about when the FCC did their big announcement of I think they called it delete, which is they're going through and seeing where they can free up some, budget or free up something. I can't remember. It's hard to understand exactly what they're doing. But somebody left a comment on, and I'd love to get your feedback on it. And I'm going to name a particular person, President of the United States at the current time, said that he has the power to do whatever he wants. If he wants to sell off the amateur spectrum, he can do that. But sounding what you guys are telling me, a leader of a country doesn't have that flexibility to do that, because there's a whole bunch of other moving parts. I don't know who wants to address that, but it sounds like to me, a leader of the country can't just make that decision.
Actually, they can. Even though these countries sign on to these various proposals for the radio regulations, they are a sovereign entity, and they have ultimately responsibility to do whatever they want within their borders without adversely affecting adjacent or their neighbors. So for example, and you picked a really good one, because when the Personal Communication Service came up with a frequency plan way back when in one of the WRCs, the US signed on to that. They came back home and implemented another plan, which really threw Canada for a loop, because we said, wait a minute, we just got back from the conference, you agreed. And they said, well, we do what we think is best for our country. And that's what they did. So there's a case in point. Anyway, I don't know whether you wanted to add something to that, Paul.
No, I think you've highlighted the issue that it can fall apart. But I mean, the whole point of the International Telecommunications Union is the fact that radio waves don't themselves know borders, only borders. And of course, this was very much the case in the early days of high frequency broadcasting, where things would go all around the world. And that was really the reason for coming together and on an international level, so that you could avoid interference between different countries and different regions. But in the end, countries are free to go back and do what they want. Hopefully that doesn't occur too often.
Now, sometimes, and when that happens, sometimes it's in our interest. I'd like to bring up the issue of 60 meters. You might recall, we have this new band, the 60-meter band. We have a little 15 kilohertz wide bandlet, starting at 51.5 kilohertz. The decision, there had already, several years ago, there was already a fair amount of demand for an amateur band at around 5 megahertz, and several countries had moved independently to give amateurs allocations, including Canada. So we had little allocations of, spot frequencies and so on. However, it was at a WRC, several WRCs ago, where the final formal decision was made to give us a 15 kilohertz wide band. Now, that's a pretty small chunk of spectrum, but it was a compromise position. And I think the one person who we can attribute the success of getting that compromise position was Paul's predecessor, Brian Rawlings, VE3QN. He was the amateur radio representative at a previous WRC, and because he was on the Canadian delegation, things happened in such a way that he ended up chairing a session, and he was able to sort of force an ultimate conclusion, force a compromise against the opposition of some very powerful countries to there being an amateur allocation there. So I kind of like to call 60 meters the Brian band, because Brian got it for us in the face of a substantial opposition. And that shows, again, the value of Paul or Brian or somebody like them being on a member of the national delegation. They might have that responsibility devolved to them, and they could make the compromise that is ultimately in our interests. IRU wouldn't be able to do that, but a member of the Canadian delegation could.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that makes sense. Paul, do you want to add something?
No, I think Dave has just discussed it very well. I mean, this was before I became directly involved as an advisor to RAC, but it certainly was. You can get things done if you're part of a delegation, no doubt about that. If you have good relations with your delegation, which we do. RAC has very good relations with the people in ISED.
So if you're, I'll just say the average, parks on the air activator. You play ham radio on the weekends, you drive down to the local park and you set up a portable radio station. Why does this matter to me as a small time ham radio operator? Trying to understand why all this international stuff really matters to me, a guy who wants to set up a radio in a park and just call CQ for an afternoon.
Well, the fact of the matter is we have a lot of spectrum, and that's great, but it's always under pressure. And without spectrum, Buddy wouldn't be going in the park and doing that kind of operation. We need that spectrum. We need to be able to defend it. So we've had a lot of success for a long time, but we can't take it for granted. I guess there's an old slogan, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. This is our circumstance. The price of our spectrum is eternal vigilance against those who might want to use it for some other purpose. So it's a great thing that the guy who's doing the park in the hour operation, or the contester, the DXer, or the EME guy, that they don't have to think about this stuff. It's a very good thing. However, they should spare at least a small thought for the moment that there is a lot of work that goes into ensuring that we have that spectrum so they can do that thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I know, gentlemen, this must come with a significant cost. Serge, you're not sitting there in Geneva doing the work you're doing. Paul, you're not going out doing the stuff you're doing and paying for this out of your own pocket, right? There's got to be, we all love ham radio, but there comes a limit to what we can do. So how does this get funded? And I see Dave's a step ahead of me here, got it up on the screen already. How does all this get funded? How do Canadian amateurs get involved? All the stuff that they need to do to make sure that your efforts are supported.
So the Defense of Amateur Radio Fund is actually a legal trust which is administered by the Radio Amateurs of Canada. And the sole purpose of this fund is to support the travel expenses of a nominated amateur as a member of the Canadian delegation to the various international telecommunication and world radio conference prep meetings. So as the fund actually pays for the delegates' travel and living expenses, and by the way, I don't know how many have come to Geneva, but it is a very expensive place. In fact, I think the exchange rate yesterday was 1.7 to one Canadian. One Canadian was 1.7 to the franc, to the Swiss franc. So it's very, very expensive. And that's, we pay for his living, which makes sense that you have to pay for his living expenses and travel here. He doesn't get paid for his time. And as I mentioned earlier, working 11, 12 hours a day, that takes its toll after the course of, 4 weeks at a conference. Without the DARF funding, if we run out of money, there would be no Canadian amateur at these meetings. And then when proposals are made, as Dave just said, again, amateur spectrum, which, by the way, we go right across, right up to, I think, 300 gigahertz or even higher. We have spectrum all out there. And we are basically in a defensive mode at the time, for the time being, because, anyone looking for spectrum is going to look for any piece of spectrum that's out there not being used currently, and why not ask for the amateur spectrum? So, we need to make sure that there is money to enable our representative to be there. Now, what we do is, to the extent that we can, Paul, that is, he gets up at 3 a.m. in the morning to attend the meetings in Geneva. Not an easy thing to do, believe you me. But there are meetings that, he has to be there present, face to face, in case something comes up that he can deflect right away. Because one thing about these meetings is when somebody introduces something, and if it gains momentum, it's very difficult to stop that train from rolling. So it's best to nip it in the bud. And if somebody makes a proposal, you lean over to the ISED representative and say, hey, that's wrong because we have, and whatever the story is. And then Canada can say, well, we're not really in favor of that approach because we understand blah, 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 blah. So it has to be done right away. That's the best time to do it. Anyway, I would say that without our active participation at these meetings, the ITU meetings, there would be no radio amateur voice present. And should something, as I mentioned, come up, given the insatiable connectivity requirements of the mobile industry, but also a lot of other services as well, satellite services, aeronautical services, the space sciences services, they could easily look to our spectrum that they could use or turn around and use on our behalf. They would say, well, we'll give it to us on a primary basis and leave it with the amateurs in secondary, which a lot of our spectrum is. But as Dave mentioned earlier, some of these services don't share well with amateurs. So my pitch here is where the Canadian amateur community can help greatly in order to ensure that we continue to have a voice at both the ISED preparatory meetings domestically and international through the study cycles leading to the WRC. It is very, very, very important that Canadian amateurs realize what they have and why they're able to go to the park to do a POTA activation and, continue to support the efforts through donations to DARF. And I thank you for that in advance, by the way. I'll stop there, Stuart.
No, that's great, Serge. I mean, it's so important to have a voice. And I can echo your thoughts, and Paul mentioned it as well. Being there present, and I was in the the marketing world for 30 years and IT for 30 years. I did kind of both. And you can attend conferences virtually, but being there and having hallway conversations or having a coffee. Some of us used to make decisions over numerous beers in the pub afterwards. That was so important. Even just the friendships and the camaraderie you had just by talking to people in the hallway. You can never duplicate that just by attending over a Zoom meeting. There's no replacement to that physical sharing of space.
And if I could just add, Stuart, I totally agree with what you've said. But the one important key consideration here is if Paul goes to one of these meetings and it's something that may affect the amateur service, he usually sits beside the ISED representative. So he has the ear of the regulator, real time. And you can't do that virtual. So you need to be in that room.
Nothing like a little elbow in the side, right, Paul?
Exactly, yeah. That's very true.
Now, Serge, maybe we can talk a little bit about DARF itself, how, actually, one of the things I'd like to point out is, it would be great if Canadian amateurs who contribute to DARF contribute more to DARF. However, it doesn't just have to be Canadians. People from other countries can certainly contribute to DARF and help support this Canadian representative on the delegation, because really he will, we all have radio amateurs around the world really have a common interest in securing, maintaining, and even perhaps expanding our spectrum.
Yeah, and also because of the cost of of travel these days, we've all heard that oil prices for jet fuel is skyrocketing. We are running low on money, but I totally agree with you, Dave, that, while as a Canadian amateur, I'm pleading with the Canadian amateurs to please donate, but don't limit it there. Anyone will take money from anyone, anyone at all. And we could use as much money as possible, because the World Radio Conference is coming up at the end of next year, and it's going to be expensive. And I think we did mention where that was going to be held. I believe one of your slides said that, Dave. I think it was in Shanghai. Yeah.
Not a cheap city. And to be there for a month, that's pretty demanding.
Yeah, it is. So anyway, we can continue to fund, Paul, for a little while longer, but we are looking under every rock to see if we can find more money somewhere. So highly
big sales, bottle drives, you name it.
So there's your sales pitch to the Canadian amateur and amateurs across the world. Please, not only get involved in amateur here in Canada to support the Defense of Amateur Radio Fund, but also check your local country, amateur radio group, ARRL in the US, RSGB in the UK. I'm sure they have something similar to this that needs your support. So, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to have you on here today. I really enjoy taking your time out of your day, or appreciate taking your time out of your day. They're going to talk about this very, very important topic in amateur radio that often goes overlooked by a lot of hams. So, Dave's share. Here's all the contact information for the folks that were on the call today. I'm sure I know Dave's always good for fielding questions and offering his advice or sometimes opinion on things, but he always has a colorful description on the topics at hand. And Serge and Paul, the same thing there. All the information is shared here on the screen. In closing, gentlemen, anything else you want to add? I'll start with Paul. Anything else you want to add, Paul, to wrap up today's conversation?
No, just to reinforce it. I feel very honoured to be able to represent RAC in the WRC process, and I thank the support I've already got. But we're always looking for more financial support, as Serge said, and thanks again to you, Stuart, for just giving us a little bit of a chance to give a little bit of a sales pitch.
Oh, it's my pleasure. All the credit goes to Dave, because he was the one that brought it up and said we need to talk about this. And I said, you're right. Serge, anything else you want to say to wrap up today's conversation?
Not really, other than just to thank everyone who's watching, and to please consider donating to DARF wherever you are.
And last but not least, the final word goes to my honorable friend, Mr. Goodwin, V3KG, who always has something to add. Dave, anything you want to say in closing?
All right. Well, thank you, Stuart, and thank you everyone else for listening to this. Again, one fundamental thing is, if you're a radio amateur, be a member of your national society. Whatever little issues or disputes you may have about a particular line of policy, that is the organization that represents your interests in your country and around the world through the IARU. So be a member of RAC, be a member of RSGB, DARC, ARRL, whatever your national organization is. Join it, support it, and try and make it better. So thank you, Stuart.
And you can't make it better if you're not involved. That's what I always say, because a lot of people bellyache and comment on this channel about the ARRL, because most of them are, our friends down to the south. They're always complaining about ARRL and not doing this and not doing that. So, well, my response is, what are you doing? Are you involved? Are you offering feedback? Involved? And they often say no. So, gentlemen, it's been an honor again to have you on today. I'm Stuart Victor Echo 9 Charlie Foxtrot. Once again, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and thanks to these wonderful people for joining us today to talk about this very, very, very important topic, the Defense of Amateur Radio Fund. And again, look them up online through the RAC website, and also check your local country website for something equivalent. And don't forget, as Dave mentioned, don't forget to support your national organization. It's so important. 7-3 for now, everyone. We'll see you guys in the next video.
Bye, 7-3.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.